essentially then transformed by this character, his interaction with this character over a period of time, so that toward the end of the film, he has a different viewpoint about, yes, he still wants to get over, but now he wants to get over because he has a bigger goal in mind with what he's going to do with that money, not just get bling, but in fact advance a cause, advance, it doesn't say revolution, but essentially, but certainly advance a progressive agenda, at least as he perceives it. And you see some of it, and there's been some of this in some books, in particular, oddly enough, Donald Goines, I don't know if anybody's ever read Donald Goines, and Goines was a pimp and a drug addict, and he wrote a series for maybe, he burned hot and heavy for maybe, I guess, three and a half years while he was still on the needle. And he wrote a whole series of paperback novels for Holloway House, which was a white-owned company in LA that published black pulp fiction. They published Iceberg Slim, who was a fairly successful pimp, as pimps go, from the 50s, but who then essentially wrote a kind of novelization of his life called Pimp, and several others. And Goines, when he was in the joint, was inspired by Iceberg Slim and to write and sort of pull on his life as a petty criminal and project that. But in particular, though, Goines, toward the end, and Goines dies violently. His head is blown off by a shotgun. Him and his wife's heads blown off in Detroit one evening.
This is real life.
This is real life. So he dies as he wrote. But Goines wrote a series of novels, paperback originals, about a character called Kenyatta, obviously inspired by Jomo Kenyatta, the African freedom fighter. And Kenyatta is a politicized gang lord who not only is uniting the gangs around the common purpose of protecting the hood, but also then going after crooked cops and crooked politicians. But in a certain way, it's a very idealized, very romanticized, a very simplistic, scenario he lays out. And yet, still, those paperback novels, at least among the guys I grew up with, because you could in those days you couldn't find you wouldn't find Goines' books in a bookstore. You'd find Goines' books at the bus stop. I mean, at the bus station, at a newsstand, or at the thrifty drugstore, which is the chain drugstore in my neighborhood. That's where you would find Goines' books, because Goines' readers were mostly black young men, but they gravitated to those books. So there is something to be said for the sort of crime and mystery genre being able to, in a very simple way, bring that message to folks who wouldn't necessarily pick up, Engel or Marx or Kenyatta, you know what I mean, and read that, but they would read Goines.
So it transforms itself into a utopian.
In a kind of way. A utopian in a sense of saying that the black community can protect itself and can push out the invaders. So they can't, so it can't transform a larger society, but it certainly can do something about protecting your neighborhood.
Right. Well, in a sense that, science fiction, I think, sort of had, it's sort of a boys' adventure literature became at a certain point a sort of promotional literature for a somewhat utopian future. Don't you think?
Yeah, it's a big genre with a complicated history that has many different strands in it, and it has all political positions represented in it too, because the future is a blank slate that people can write their own dreams onto. So there's no one big trend, but a kind of a battleground of people trying to claim the future by presenting the most plausible vision or the most attractive vision. And certainly H.G. Wells, as being one of the modern founders of science fiction along with Jules Verne, Wells was a leftist visionary who was tireless in his writing of utopias. From after he did his first scientific romances, which are really the ones that people remember, Time Machine, War of the Worlds, Island of Dr. Moreau, then he wrote utopias that kept attacking the problem over and over again. And what it did was establish a sense of the future that he had somewhat claimed almost to himself, because the genre hadn't been invented at that point, and he was the one doing it over and over again. He wrote a big outline of history, sort of a history of the world.
Still very crypt.
Yeah, prepared everybody, especially in the UK, but also a bit in America, as to this is what the history so he not only wrote the history, but then he tacked on the future, and it was always in the same direction, a kind of scientific meritocracy, a kind of technological accomplishment where there was food, water, shelter, clothing for everybody, and a more horizontal political structure rather than the vertical structure. It was in the midst of the worst parts of the 20th century, so always he was working against the grain of what was really happening. And yet, when they got done with World War II, and they had to reconstruct the world almost from scratch, especially the global order, everybody who got together at those meetings had H.G. Wells's vision in the back of their mind as to what should happen. And so FDR and his GI Bill and the creation of the UN and the social welfare state and the notion that governments be run by a scientific meritocracy and just things would be done sensibly and reasonably and without nepotism, without corruption, that all comes out of H.G. Wells writing that stuff over and over again in books that sold in small quantities, and yet they were repetitious and they were hitting the right crowd, the right audience that were affected by them. And the world that we built in 1945 with Bretton Woods and with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, things that have since gone disastrously wrong, nevertheless, the social welfare state itself, it comes kind of out of H.G. Wells, out of a science fiction writer, writing it over and over again and affecting the people who are making the decisions. So he was hitting a target audience of that meritocracy that later was going to take power. And everybody who got together in the post-war period to decide what the fate of the world were influenced by H.G. Wells. So
maybe in socialism, right?
Yeah, that's right. But with his own technocratic, well, exactly, it's a kind of Fabianism. He came out of his own context. Not many of his ideas were new to him, which is something I can definitely relate to. But he was a novelist who was consolidating all these previous ideas and making them into a bundle and saying, this is the picture, this is the way the future will be. So there's a tremendous power to that that goes back right into the Old Testament, the idea of prophecy. Isaiah and Jeremiah, this is what's going to happen if we keep doing this. And that can usually be negative, like we're all doomed if we keep going this way. That's kind of the dystopia. But there's also the utopia, that if only you behave in the way that the Lord wants you to, everything will come out right for your people. So there's a deep, old, ancient power to this science fiction utopian act of prophecy, saying this is the way it's all going to come out. And so I've been following that as a kind of guide to action. And you know, H.G. Wells, because of his scientific romances, he sold a lot of books because of his realist novels. He was a bestseller. He was a national character. He was an international intellectual character on the stage, and so what he did had an effect. That's very hard these days, I think, to establish. But nevertheless, he's a good model, I think, for a science fiction writer to say, you can make stories that are commercially successful, interesting, dramatic, powerful stories, and yet they also present a future that's different from now and is better than. And it's kind of an obvious train of thought. You're thinking, well, it seems like we're a smart species, we're in control of the planet, and so it seems like things will be better in the future because things are so stupid now. And it can't help but get better. And so there's a sense that the future is going to be better, and you can play into that. You can say, well, yeah, it's going to get better, and it's because of this and that and the other thing. And you can write these stories time after time and try to make them still entertainments, to make them what genres for. The people, I mean, science fiction and even H.G. Wells was being bought also at the drugstore.
Right.
Just, you spin that circular thing,
That's right.
and it would go from crime to science
That's
fiction
right.
to
That's
crime
right.
to science fiction,
That's right.
and these were the genres that people were reading.
That's right.
And a lot of my first readings came out of a used bookstore, a kind of a secret pornography, cigarette, tobacco shop in lower Santa Ana, California, where used mysteries and used science fiction were really the thing that were selling. And so I think it's a nice part of literature to have that genre can be political because it's talking directly to an audience that isn't trained to literature, that isn't specialized in literature.
But it seems to be sometimes genre is more political because I don't know, maybe it's able to take on these big questions. I don't know.
Just because it's under the radar.
Maybe because it's under the radar.
Or it doesn't
but-
have to conform to the academic definition of great literature, which would be all about character, but that always turns out to be about upper middle class
Right.
white characters.
But at the same time, a big part of genre was always like the Western. Does not deal with that, you know. Or I was interested in what you were saying about in your interview in the Outspoken Author book. You talk about how noir is about a doomed character in a doomed world, and the way you were describing it, it's almost like it's almost more like the novel's more about character than the world. The world's sort of a given, and you're not really changing the world, you're changing the character's relationship to it. And I was just wondering, also, it intersects, to me, like you're talking about Goins and Iceberg Slim, there's also I wouldn't call it a genre, but it's a category of black literature. And I'm thinking about Native Son, I'm thinking of Richard, the contradictions. Richard Wright is sort of, in many ways, the H.G. Wells of black literature to me. He's the troubled inventor, you know, and who started out as a communist, as a functionary in the Communist Party.
But falls out of favor.
Yeah, and then
For his writing.
Was that? Yeah. Well, I wonder if you could address some of that, because Native Son also seems, in many ways, you're talking about a crime novel written from the point of view of the criminal. You know, I mean, how do you see Richard Wright in relationship to Goins? I'm sure they never met.
Yeah. That's actually very interesting. Because you're right, in a lot of ways, you can certainly read Native Son as a crime novel, right? As Bigger Thomas's fall, as his descent. Though, of course, you know, Wright gets in his criticisms of the party and functionaries and I suppose a little bit of bourgeois society as well, you know, in the novel. Interesting enough, by the way, just another weird parenthetical point or thing, which is I've actually seen, there's two versions of Native Son, but there's a version of Native Son where Wright plays the character. Plays Bigger Thomas.
In a movie? Or?
Yes, in a movie. In a Brazilian production, like from the 50s.
Oh, that's right. He moved to Brazil.
Yes, there we go. So a la Spillane, who eventually plays Mike Hammer in The Girl Hunters, which is one of the worst. It's a movie so bad, it's just interesting because it's so bad. Native Son is not bad. It's just interesting to see the writer playing his character, playing his alter ego. So certainly it's the case that, but obviously because it is great literature. It's a well done novel, which is not taking anything away from one way or the other. And of course, I'm certainly Wright would fight to be categorized as a genre. I would assume would fight to not be categorized as a genre. Right. It's taught in universities and stuff, which is great, which is fine. Which you should read it. You should still read the book. So that is this kind of interesting, I don't know, subset, you know, so that from Richard Wright, between Richard Wright and Goins, there's still people like Nathan Hurd, Clarence Cooper Jr., who wrote this book in 1960 called The Scene. And The Scene is about the drug world, but it's also about cops. And in a lot of ways, in fact, it's a lot of stuff that you see gets transformed into The Wire, you know, decades later. So there's always been a kind of, I don't know, subgenre or substrata of these black writers who in some ways, Wright being somewhat the exception, but who were not in fact accepted by the black literati, because in fact they wrote about drugs or pimps and whores, and they wrote it from their points, you know, about these lives from their points of view. So they weren't just tourists or observers. In fact, the sad case of Clarence Cooper, he, like Goins, stayed on the needle or fell back into drugs. So they wrote from